we're very lucky tonight to have Baroness Scotland, having come all the way from London this evening, to speak to us on domestic violence. The York Union's running a series of talks as last term, this term, and these next 2 weeks are our busiest, so hopefully this will run quite smoothly. The Baroness needs no introduction really. She's had a formidable career, being the first black woman to be appointed to the Queen's Council and rise in the ranks of British legal politics up to the first female Secretary Attorney General. I'm going to pass over quite quickly so that we have a lot of time for her to discuss her work and so that you have ample time to ask questions afterwards. As per usual, once the event is finished, there'll be a small wine reception in the foyer and you can have the chance to speak to the Baroness and we'll hopefully wrap everything up by about 8 o'clock. So thank you once again, and introducing Baroness Scotland.
Firstly, can I thank Lizzie for inviting me to come and speak to you all on a wonderful, dark January Friday evening. I was sitting thinking that many of you must have a very exciting life, because I can't think of anything else you'd rather do on a January Friday evening. But one of the real reasons why I accepted this invitation is that, in fact, I had the privilege of working for quite some time with Tim Godwin, who was the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, and we worked very hard on criminal justice issues together. And one of the issues that we worked on very hard was domestic violence. And I want to just tell you a little bit about that journey. I don't know how many of you in this room, just give me a straw poll, know any of the facts to deal with domestic violence. Just stick your hand up. A few of you? Okay. So then I'll invite you on a journey with me. In 2003, I was appointed as the Criminal Justice Minister in the Home Office. I was Deputy to the Home Secretary, and I remained in that post from 2003 to 2007. So I had 3 Secretaries of State during that period, and I remained the constant. And in 2003, I was given by the then Prime Minister Tony Blair 2 little jobs. The first little job I had to do is to reduce crime. And the second little job I had to do was to seek, if I possibly could, if I had a minute or two, to eradicate domestic violence. So, no problem there then. And being a lawyer, I wanted to know the empirical data. What was I facing? What sort of crime did we have? Where was it? Who was committing it? And why were they committing that crime? So I started to look at the nature of the crime that was affecting our country. And I discovered something quite astounding. I'd been working as a lawyer for a very long time in issues to deal with children, violence against women. I'd done a number of public inquiries, and I had some very strong views about how we could change the paradigm we were sitting in. But what did I find in 2003? I discovered that 25% of all violent crime in our country was domestic in nature. It affected 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men, and about between 750,000 and 950,000 children in our country. That 89% of the repeat victims were women, and that it was one of the major causes of death in our country for women. We had 120 women every single year. That's 2 or 3 women were dying at the hands of their partner or their ex-partner. And I was also entrusted with the offender management. So I looked at who we had in our prisons. And what I discovered in talking to the prison governor in Holloway was that 89% of the women in Holloway had a history of domestic violence or sexual abuse prior to becoming offenders. And a large level of dysfunction came from that. They were overrepresented in terms of alcoholism, drug addiction, mental illness, and every form of dysfunction known to man. And then when I looked at my youth justice estate, I discovered that 2/3 of the children in the youth justice estate came from dysfunctional homes in which domestic violence featured largely. And then when I looked at my adult estate, I discovered that most people who go to adult male prison graduate there from the juvenile estate. And more than 2/3 of them had been children living in domestic violence homes prior to their graduation. So I basically discovered I had an epidemic on my hands. And if I wanted to attack that little target Toadie had given me about reducing crime, then it was fundamental that we do something about domestic violence. And if we just think about how many women and men are in this room, and just think it's 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men. Men tend to be slightly smarter though, because repeat victimization tends to happen to women and men tend to leave early. A woman will stay in a violent relationship, usually because she has children, for anything up to 5 years. So the damage that's caused to women is much greater than that was caused to men. So what were we going to do about this? I discovered that actually what lots of people care about is money. If I knocked on doors and said I wanted to do something about it, everybody tends to say to you, I'm really sorry, I'd love to help, but I have no money. And when I told people that I was quite determined to change the paradigm in which we were sitting in domestic violence, I was greeted with a great deal of sighs. Firstly, my civil servants who quite liked me tried to tell me that I was being very bold. And when a civil servant tells you you're being very bold, it means you're slightly crazy. And then when I said I wanted to reduce the number of deaths coming from domestic violence, then they told me I was being very brave. Now that means you're probably certifiable. And then when I said that we wanted to also reduce the number of children who are affected by it, reduce the number of actual bodily harm, and I wanted to have positive outcomes, I think they went into total meltdown and wanted to protect me from myself. And the reason they wanted to protect me from myself is they probably quite liked me as a minister, and they looked around and thought, we'd rather keep the one we have than get another one, so can we just try and contain her and make her slightly sane? But I believed that if we could build a partnership and an understanding, we could change this. And I believe that very strongly indeed. So I identified what people care about is money, and I thought, well, let's try and monetarize this. What are we talking about? We discovered, and Professor Sylvia Walby did some research for us, that domestic violence was costing us as a country, how much do you think? You want to take a guess as to how much it was costing us? Yeah? 23 billion pounds a year. 23 billion. 3.1 billion was government, public sector. 2.7 billion was loss of profitability in terms of business. So 75% of people who are at work and are victims are targeted at work. Texting, telephoning, following. And 17 billion was paying injury, loss and suffering. So what I then did is we disaggregated the 3 billion. I was $1 billion from criminal justice, $1 billion of my budget criminal justice was domestic violence. 1.2 billion was health, not including mental health and children. So the bottom line was this was affecting us very badly indeed. But I also identified that we were all spending money on the same things, and that if we found out a way of doing it together, we could make a material change. And we did. And we did. But it's a problem that isn't just a problem for our country. It's a problem that is global. And last year, the World Health Organization came out with statistics which demonstrated that across the world, it affects 1 in 3 women across the world. In 2004, they'd done a bit of research which suggested something similar, but lots of people were criticising that research. They said it was too small, it had not followed proper principles, it couldn't be relied on. Well, the World Health Organization then did an empiric study over 5 years, because domestic violence comes in many forms. It affects people of all ages, of all sexes, of all descriptions. And the original analysis by the World Health Organization included the broader definition, so that's physical, sexual, emotional, financial, all those different forms. And they said 1 in 3. The new study focused on physical and sexual violence. And so don't count the emotional, don't count the financial, don't count the psychological. And the new figure was 1 in 3 women were affected by that. So it was worse than we actually found. And the report's findings, I just want to touch on some of them for you. They found globally 38% of women who were murdered by their intimate partners. And 42% of women who have experienced physical or sexual violence at the hands of their partner had experienced injuries as a result. When it came to depression, they found that partner violence is a major contributor to women's mental health problems, with women who had experienced partner violence being almost twice as likely to experience depression compared to women who have not experienced any violence. Alcoholism, women experiencing intimate partner violence are almost twice as likely as other women to have alcohol use problems. And then, as far as sexually transmitted diseases were concerned, women who experience physical and or sexual partner violence are 1.5 times more likely to acquire syphilis infection, chlamydia, gonorrhea, and in some regions, including sub-Saharan Africa, they're 1.5 times more likely to acquire HIV. As far as unwanted pregnancy is concerned, both partner violence and non-partner sexual violence are associated with unwanted pregnancy. And the report found that women experiencing physical or sexual partner violence are twice as likely to have an abortion than women who do not experience this violence. And there was also issues like low birth weight. So the new data shows that violence against women is extremely common, and the world have finally decided that we urgently need to invest in prevention to address the underlying causes of this global women's health problem. And that was said by Professor Charlotte Watts, who was at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who undertook lots of the research that was dealing with it. But what we found was that the victims themselves felt stigmatized by this violence. They felt ashamed. They didn't want to tell anyone, because quite often they felt somehow it was their fault, and the guilt about it had been transferred from the perpetrator to the victim. So you could almost describe domestic violence as a subtle sort of plague, devouring the psychological, emotional, and physical well-being of an individual, never ceasing until in some cases it results in their ultimate death. And it does not discriminate. And this is really frightening, because you'd like to think that if you were a certain religion, if you were a certain colour, if you came from a certain group, if you had a certain financial position, that somehow you'd be inured from it. Maybe if you had one leg, you wouldn't be subjected to it. And what's terrifying is it's something which affects all of us. And it's not something that necessarily many of us ever talk about. And I want to make it clear that when I first discovered this whole issue about domestic violence, when I was about 2021, I'd finished my degree at 20, and I was doing my bar exams. And so I started to look at family law as one of the subjects, and we started to look at domestic violence. I come from a very small family. As some of you will know, I'm one of my parents' 12 only children. And I'm their 10th only child of the 12. And I grew up with 7 brothers and a father who I absolutely adored. And so many of my girlfriends also thought I was slightly strange, because I grew up believing men were fantastic. What they were kind and generous and warm and loving and could be poetic and romantic, and they walked on the outside of the road and they carried your bag. They were just to die for. So the first time I read a petition, divorce petition, in which a husband was very violent to his wife, I was really in a state of shock. And I remember going home, and I was still living at home at that time doing my pupillage, and saying to my father, "Daddy, I can't believe it. It was his wife." And I remember my father looking at me, "Poor thing, my child." And saying, "Well, darling, it happens." Well, I didn't know that it happened. And so I would have been one of the 3 out of 4 women to whom it had never happened, and I'd never seen it, and I didn't know about it, and whose eyes would have been closed to it. And from that moment, I haven't been able to close my eyes to it ever again, because it is a real issue in terms of human rights. Most of us achieve because we're loved and we're nurtured and we're enabled. If someone grows up with violence and anger as the root of what nurtures them, they are diminished. And it's much harder for them to achieve that which they could achieve if they were nurtured with love, with care, with warmth and affection. And so I think it's because I had the opposite experience that has made me so passionate about trying to make sure that the experience for women and men in the future was more similar to the experience I had had. And the heart-wrenching reality of domestic violence in the United Kingdom is that it affects an estimated of 1.2 million women in varying forms. And they go, as I said earlier, far beyond the confines of physical violence and assault commonly associated with domestic violence. And they can affect psychological, emotional, and even reproductive capabilities of men, women, and children. And so I think we have to understand that this is a global issue and not just a national issue. And domestic violence has always been a major health, economic, human rights, gender equality, and overall major societal issue. Whether explicit or not, it touches and impacts every facet of society, from the domestic environment to the professional, legal, and economic spheres. And with over 30 million employees in our country, just as breast cancer, childcare, bereavement, mental health issues affect the lives of our employees, so too does domestic violence. And we often perceive domestic violence as a private matter. But if, as I said earlier, 75% of people who endure domestic violence are targeted at work, and if we think of the workplace as a safe haven, which thankfully they often are, but you at work are receiving 50 texts a day, or you're being watched at work, or someone's sending you flowers, and everyone says at work, how wonderful, you get a bouquet every day from your partner, isn't that lovely? But they don't know that your abuser has said, those are the flowers he's going to put on your grave. And every time those flowers come, it's a threat that you understand means you're likely to die today or tomorrow. And the question is, how do you tell anyone about that? And so what happens to the work colleagues who see the impact that's having on their colleague, but they've got nowhere to go? These are real things that if we open our eyes we get to see. So the extent and effect of domestic violence is not confined to those who are physically affected. It also influences the children that we've spoken about, the children living with that level of violence. And it's really sad to know that for 30% of women who become pregnant, pregnancy at the time should be a great, wonderful moment in any woman's life, that the violence either starts in pregnancy or accelerates in pregnancy. And that's why it is domestic violence ends up being, for those between 15 and 44, the greatest cause of morbidity in women and girls. So children who witness domestic violence are overrepresented in every figure of dysfunction, just as we saw earlier. They're overrepresented in the truanting figures, in the figures in relation to those who abuse alcohol, those who get involved in drugs, those who get involved in criminal activity. Major, major contribution. And the psychological effects on domestic violence means that sometimes there's another way out for people who can't bear it. You may get killed by your partner, but many victims who can't bear it actually take their own lives. So we have to look at our suicide figures as well as anything else. But before you get too gloomy, I have to tell you that coming together across government, with local authorities, with charities, with business, between 2003 and 2010, we did make a difference. We reduced domestic violence during that period by 64%. And we saved 7.1 billion economic cost every year. And if I can give you an example of what that means in terms of London, and this is some work that Tim Godwin and I had worked on together, and I have to tell you, I think he must have dreaded my telephone calls, because I would ring him up regularly to say, what's the figure today? And he always knew what figure I was talking about. When we started, we had 49 women die in London. And we worked out that if you just want to talk in money, and you know George Osborne loves money, so if you're ever talking to him, just tell him about figures, money, 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 money. Every death cost 1.1 million to the criminal justice system. Every death. So that 49 women represent over £50 million worth of economic cost to the criminal justice system. By the time I left government in 2010, in London, somebody give me a guess, how many women died in London? And I'll say any figure is a figure too much, so it wasn't naught. Anyone want to have a guess? You're not allowed to, Lizzie, in case you know. 13? 13? Any offers above 13?
25?
5 women, from 49 to 5. So if you just want to talk about economic cost, we went from 50 million to 5.5 million. But forget just the cost of that. Think about the impact, because most of the women who died had 2 or 3 children. So the impact on their lives of seeing your mother killed by her partner or your father and the long-term damage that caused. So we knew that we could change things. And when we looked at the figures, there was a direct correlation from the areas where we were able to put in the multi-agency risk assessment approach and the independent domestic violence and a whole new system. There was a direct correlation between those areas where we had the system up and running and those areas where we didn't, because in all those areas where the system was operating, the numbers of people being killed, suffering from grievous bodily harm, actual bodily harm, and children went down. And in those areas where we didn't have a full integrated system, they tended not to. So we could have the empirical data which showed that it worked. And in fact, there's an international report last year which said that what we'd done in the United Kingdom during that time was significantly, statistically important, because what the change we brought about happened nowhere else. But we shared our data in 2006 with Spain, because I honestly believe that what we were doing together across disciplines, anyone could do, because the bad thing about domestic violence is it has an almost identical DNA globally. The good thing about domestic violence is it has a global DNA. So what works for us is likely to work for others. We shared it with Spain. They implemented a similar system to ours. They made improvements. We had loads of discussion about that to our system. And they reduced domestic homicide in Spain by 25% in 4 years. So I absolutely know it works. And so it seemed to me that it then became a question of choice. So the 20 years that I had worked on this issue before I came into government really made a difference. And I suppose I just explain why the multi-agency risk assessment worked. In the past, none of the different agencies would know what had happened before, and coordination was really difficult. So what we were trying to do is to let everyone know what the others knew, so that when you looked at the police knew about injuries that the victim had arrived at the accident emergency department of the local hospital. The social services knew the concerns of the housing officer, and the teachers knew what the health workers had thought when they visited the home. So instead of making these decisions in a vacuum, we were making decisions on an informed basis. And we changed the way our prosecution figures started. When we started, we had about, in some areas, we had a 29% success rate. That means, and that was 21% of people pleading guilty, and 8% of people being found guilty. So that wasn't actually very good, because we had 71% of people not having a successful outcome. So we really looked at why that was. Why weren't we being successful? And we changed our processes. And by the time I left, we had at least, across the country, we had at least 72.5% success rate. So the confidence that people had they could come forward and they would have a valid outcome was going to be improved. So over 11 years as a minister and latterly as Attorney General, I saw the disproportionate burden that domestic violence had on the criminal justice system, as well as the other public services, particularly health and policing. But I also saw that working together, we could make a real significant difference, but the emphasis was on working together. And when I left government, I really hoped that this process that we had developed would continue, and unfortunately it hasn't quite. And one of the major changes has been the removal of legal aid, which has been quite devastating. I've created two things since I left government. Once is the Corporate Alliance Against Domestic Violence as a charity. We had created it as a non-charity, as an entity in 2005, but now it is a charity to help businesses from all over the country who wish to change the paradigm in which their employees who are suffering from domestic violence sit, can learn the tools, can share them, and can better protect their employees, and they're doing a great job and saving lives. And the other thing I've done is create the global foundation for the elimination of domestic violence, so we can share the data that we have, the methodology we've developed with the rest of the world. And if you look at the Istanbul Convention, I'm sure all of you will now go and look at the Istanbul Convention, you will see that the basis of much of the practice that's advocated in that convention is based on some of the work we did in the UK. So the examples, not the examples, is from the United Kingdom. Now our vision is, in terms of the corporate alliance, for every employer to respond effectively to domestic violence with practical tools. They have accredited training and solutions that employers can utilise to increase safety for their staff. And EDV is continuing, Eliminate Domestic Violence, is continuing to work collaboratively across the world. We're in Italy, we're supposed to be going to Jordan. Italy have ratified the Istanbul Convention, we still haven't. Working with Laura Baldini, who's the President of the Senate, and others to see if they can't implement a similar system to ours. So the fight, though, is far from over. And as I say, it is becoming increasingly difficult now because of the legal aid cuts. All family legal aid, family law legal aid has gone, and the only legal aid that's left now is for domestic violence cases, but that is really very constrained. The Legal Aid Act in 1949 made it possible for people of, irrespective of their income, to get legal assistance, and I think that legal assistance is still very much needed. The figures that I've recently been given about legal aid make me very sad indeed. Now, to get legal aid if you're a domestic violence victim, you have to prove a number of things. Evidence is needed for legal help. You have to either have an opponent, the person, the perpetrator has to have a conviction for domestic violence, or the police have had to have cautioned the person for domestic violence within the last 2 years, or they have evidence of current criminal proceedings, or they've got an undertaking that they won't assault, or there's a letter from the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, or there's a finding in the last 2 years, or there's a letter from the health professional and a letter from the police setting that out, or a letter from the DV organisation. Many of those people ask for a fee. So if you want a medical report, you have to come up with 50 quid. And lots of victims don't have £50. And if you have to wait for the letter, you might have to wait a week or two. And many victims haven't got a week or two because their courage fails them. One of the things that we managed to do before is to have a holistic response, assisted by legal aid. Immediately the person came forward, because quite often that person would have been assaulted 37 or 39 times before they got the courage to come forward. So that's the bad news, but the good news is I absolutely believe that we can eliminate domestic violence if we choose. I was told that what we did between 2003 and 2010 was impossible. It couldn't be done. But we did it. And I think we have the power to do it again if we choose. And if the government doesn't choose, I think all of us individually have the power to make this better. And one of the most powerful things I would ask you to do is to talk about it. Talk about it to your friends. Talk about it to the people you know. Because when I've spoken to a number of victims and asked them, why didn't you say anything? And their answer has quite often been, nobody asked. Nobody asked. So I think one of the most powerful things we can all do is to ask. And the next time you see somebody looking slightly distressed, who's a friend of yours, why don't you ask, how are you? and hang around for the answer. Hang around for the answer, and just give them the space to say what is really happening in their lives. So the bad thing is it's a problem, but the good thing is we now have the systemic solutions which we can use together if we choose. And it doesn't have to be government and local government on their own. We can be part of the dynamic to bring change, because had we in government not managed to get local government and local people and business and charities and third sectors working together, we would never have achieved what we did during those years. It took all of us, and I am forever grateful to all the wonderful people, the police officers, the prosecutors, the judges, the social workers, the probation officers, the charity workers, the businesses who didn't think I was mad, or rather they were just as crazy as I was. And together we changed something that needed changing, and I hope that each of you will think about something that's within your purview that needs changing and change it too. Thank you very much.